Let's talk more about how carbohydrate intake increases the fat in your blood. I know this is kind of hard to wrap your head around mentally because you're like, well, how can eating bread raise my blood fats? It's a carbohydrate. But today we're going to talk about a paper titled The Effect of Dietary Carbohydrates on Triglyceride Metabolism in Humans. This is a phenomenal paper. Although it hasn't been highly cited, I think the evidence that is reviewed in this particular review article is highly pertinent for a lot of people because we're going to focus on a biomarker known as blood triglycerides, which is often included in your conventional Chem24 and CBC where you get on annual physicals from your doctor. But most doctors, as you know, are focused on LDL cholesterol because LDL is purportedly atherogenic, meaning it can become modified or oxidized and create arterial plaque. But we know that high blood triglycerides are independently associated with coronary artery disease, all-cause mortality, and even are linked with metabolic syndrome. And I think this is really important to understand because most doctors, they don't have time to do waist circumference measurement. In fact, a recent study found that only 6% of family practice and internal medicine doctors routinely test one's waist circumference, which is really a strong indicator of poor cardiometabolic health because usually, as you know, cardiovascular health is not just an isolated phenomenon. It's because people have cardiometabolic risk factors and metabolic syndrome. They have adiposity, low muscle mass, they have an increased waist-to-hip ratio, they have all these lipid derangements as well as metabolic derangements. And it turns out that blood triglycerides are a strong indicator of dyslipidemia as well as insulin resistance. And it turns out that carbohydrate intake increases your blood triglycerides. I know that triglycerides are a fat. So let's talk about how eating carbs raises your blood fats and how that's problematic. This has been known for a long time. When individuals reduce their intake of dietary fat and increase their intake of carbohydrate, a common observation is that blood triglycerides increased. Now, Steve Ahrens has talked a lot about this, and Nina Teicholz talks about this in the book Big Fat Surprise. When Ansel Keys was promoting low-fat, higher-carb diets to purportedly prevent cardiovascular disease and deaths linked with cardiovascular disease, Ahrens said, hey, look, dietary carbs increase blood triglycerides. This is problematic, and everyone ignored him, and he essentially got ostracized and bullied out of the scientific community for saying such. But we now know that this phenomenon of carbohydrate-induced elevations in triglycerides is known as carbohydrate-induced hypertriglyceridemia, also known by the acronym HPTG. And it's been observed in many different research studies over the years where low-fat diets for just 5 days, low-fat, high-carb diets, increase blood triglycerides. Now, the thing that we really want to focus on in today's show is whether or not the observation is linked from increased absorption and de novo synthesis from carbohydrates to fats, or if it's reduced clearance. And I think that is still sort of a little bit murky in the literature. And there is a lot of inter-individual variation here. Some people, for example, Asians, can consume a lot higher carbohydrates compared to, say, Caucasians or Europeans and not have this carbohydrate-induced hypertriglyceridemia. So there's a lot of inter-individual variability here, which is why I recommend blood work, which is why I recommend testing. So we're going to talk about that in more detail very soon. But friends, I just want to thank you for being here. Hopefully you're enjoying this content. Hit that like button if you are. Leave a comment in the comment section below. We're going to get into the weeds here on the association with triglycerides and carbohydrate intake. I think it's really fascinating. Now, because carbs are so easy to consume, cookies, crackers, ice cream, cakes, pastries, there's a tool that can help you prevent some of these cravings. It's known as berberine. Berberine is one of the most effective ways to decrease your appetite. It's a phenomenal natural product that's been used for over 3,000 years in traditional Chinese medicine. So over at Myoscience, we developed the berberine fasting accelerator. This can be used in the evening time to help kick some of those cravings. If you are susceptible like me to having some sweets in the evening, maybe it's a little cookie, maybe it's a little ice cream, maybe a little sweet, you can take 2 to 3 capsules of the berberine fasting accelerator, and that really helps to curb those evening food cravings. It can increase blood ketones and make fasting easier. So you can save using the code podcast over at myoscience.com. Again, the berberine fasting accelerator is a natural tool to help curb some of the carb cravings over at myoscience.com. Save with the code podcast. So let's get back and talk about the association between carbohydrate intake and increased blood fats. I think it's really important to acknowledge that there is a large dossier of literature, and this actually was inspired by a comment that I received. Someone said, well, we've done many videos on triglycerides, and the person said, well, how can eating carbs raise my blood fats. And so here we go. A carbohydrate-induced effect on fasting triglyceride elevations has been established over the past 4 decades. And it is now clear that concentrations of both VLDL, that is the very low density lipoprotein, as well as chylomicrons are elevated in the fasting state when people have a lot of carbs in their diet. The effect of carbohydrate feeding increases blood triglyceride concentrations in the postprandial state has become more evident as of late. In fact, one study in postmenopausal women found that when women gradually increase the carbohydrate consumption in their diet from 50% of total energy to 67% of all of their energy, the fasting triglycerides rose up to 159 milligrams per deciliter to 203 milligrams per deciliter by just changing the carb intake in their diet by some 17%. Now, I know most of you are not consuming, 67% of your overall calories from carbohydrates, but this study, this short duration study, found that by just slowly changing, gradually changing or increasing the carb intake in your diet, it increases blood triglycerides. Now, if you're living in Canada or Europe, the numbers were 1.8 millimole per liter in the 50% of overall energy from carbs to 2.3 millimole per liter, which again is far too high. The ratio that you want, and I think triglycerides are really important to talk in context. You basically want a 1-to-1 ratio of your blood triglycerides to HDL. We'll feature that on another video, but that's important to recognize. So let's say your HDL is 60. If your blood triglycerides are 60 or lower, that would be ideal. And the ratios for women, actually, if it gets over 1.1, meaning that triglycerides are higher than the HDL, that's when things get problematic. And for men, it appears there's a gender bias or difference that when men's triglycerides to the HDL get over 1.5, that's when problems occur. So for example, if you're a male and your fasting triglycerides are 100 and your HDL, we're talking milligrams per deciliter, are 50, that would be problematic. So ideally, your triglycerides and HDL should be on par with each other. And for most Americans, most people that are unhealthy, that have prediabetes, belly fat, metabolic syndrome, their ratios are skewed. Blood triglycerides are often 2 or 3 times higher than their HDL. And it turns out that the ratio is more important than the total numbers and is more sensitive at picking up insulin resistance. That's really important to acknowledge. There's a lot of people with insulin resistance with low LDL cholesterol or high LDL cholesterol. LDL doesn't correlate with the cardiometabolic dysregulation. Now, another interesting finding from this particular study, as well as others, is the BMI or body mass index, which roughly correlates with body fat percentage, dictates how much carbohydrates will increase blood triglycerides. And it turns out that more heavier set people with a little bit overweight or obese, would have a more exaggerated increase in blood triglycerides with carbohydrate intake. And that's why, I sort of push back a little bit with the low carb community for every single person. If you're very physically fit and very active, you can afford more carbohydrates. But if you are not so lean and you don't exercise, evidence suggests that those carbohydrates might be converted by way of de novo lipogenesis, that is the conversion of carbohydrates to lipids, and raise your blood triglycerides. And so I think that's what's really important, because the metabolic health dictates the breakdown of the clearance of these carbohydrates, and probably influences as well the conversion of carbohydrates into blood triglycerides and VLDL and chylomicrons. Now, in the short term, high carbohydrate meals increase blood triglyceride levels acutely, and this is characterized or quantified by an increase in apolipoprotein B48, which is different from the ApoB 100 that we've been talking about extensively over the past several years. And so this was noted in one particular study, finding differences in ApoB 48 levels in people that consume low glycemic index carbs versus high glycemic index carbs. And it turns out that the high glycemic index carbs, like the processed foods and white bread and the sort, were characterized by a higher blood level of ApoB 48, which is VLDL cholesterol, up to 6 hours after the meal. And so there wasn't a strong association with overall changes, but there was a greater post-meal increase in the ApoB 48, which would indicate, and we know this from other data, that processed foods are linked with coronary artery disease and poor metabolic health, that increases possibly the production, the insulin resistance created and the metabolic dysregulation as a consequence of consuming these foods, increase atherogenic particles, and that could be problematic. But over the long term, there's a characterization of a decreased clearance of triglycerides and VLDL and the chylomicrons when people habitually consume a high carbohydrate diet, especially if there's some underlying poor metabolic health. So even after just 4 weeks of a high carb, low fat diet, there is higher absolute concentrations of triglycerides from VLDL and chylomicrons in the postprandial period. Various studies have actually shown. And so I think this is important to acknowledge that in the acute state, so just several days of, say, eating cupcakes and brownies and cookies and ice cream that are high in sugar and processed carbs would increase your blood triglycerides. And then over the long haul, that also increases your blood triglycerides and fat in the blood, and that is linked with problems. And that is characterized by a reduced clearance of these chylomicrons and VLDL-related particles when you're consuming a lot of carbs. And so this is the connection. There's probably an increase in de novo lipogenesis from carbohydrates, meaning you're consuming the carbs, you have a lot of carbs, and they're not going anywhere because you're not exercising, you're sedentary. So your body's trying to figure out, okay, well, what can we do with all these carbohydrates? Well, we can convert them to fat. And it turns out that insulin helps to foster that conversion process. And then if this goes on chronically, then that can be obviously stored in adipose tissue and the like. Now, it is important to recognize that the increase in ApoB 48 that we talked about, which is a marker of chylomicrons and VLDL, is linked with insulin resistance. Here's a recent, not too recent, this was published actually in 2001. Acute hyperinsulinemia modulates plasma apolipoprotein B48 triglyceride-rich lipoproteins in healthy subjects during the postprandial period. So consuming processed foods increases these unhealthy lipid phenotypes, and that's problematic. So it is important to recognize that insulin is involved there. A recently published paper titled Whole and Refined Grain Consumption and Longitudinal Factors of Cardiometabolic Risk Factors in the Framingham Offspring Cohort also showed that consumption of processed foods raises triglycerides. So it's not just all carbs, these processed carbs in general can become problematic. So I think it's just important to acknowledge excessive carbohydrates that don't corroborate with your exercise intensity or volume or regularity are really the problem, and they start to cause metabolic dysregulation. And we know that the triglyceride to HDL ratio is critically important. But in conclusion, there's ample evidence to suggest that a low-fat, high-carbohydrate diet, especially in susceptible persons with underlying poor metabolic health, will increase blood triglyceride concentrations and therefore increase cardiometabolic risk factors. So I think there's a lot of inter-individual or personal differences or variability here in how people tolerate carbohydrates. They are not all the same. So if you have increased belly fat, increased waist-hip ratio, waist circumference, underlying insulin resistance, there is good reason to consider restricting the carbohydrate intake in your diet, especially from the ultra-processed carbohydrates, high glycemic index carbohydrates, because those can be converted into atherogenic lipoproteins, raising your cardiometabolic risk factors. So that is the conclusion of this video. Ample evidence to suggest that carbs increase triglycerides, but there is some differences here. It's not a uniform situation, and that's why if we just look at, well, Asian folks eat a higher carb diet, they have rice, so can I. Well, they are different from a microbiome standpoint, genetic standpoint. And so it turns out that a lot of Westerners that are consuming the high carbohydrate diets, they have underlying cardiometabolic risk factors, poor cardiovascular health, and the importance of the triglyceride to HDL ratio exemplifies that. And it turns out that underlying metabolic health influences the trajectory of the carbohydrate metabolism that has been influenced by this particular paper here. So as always, friends, I appreciate you tuning all the way in. Hopefully you found this content helpful. We'll catch you in a future episode down the road.